me share with you a small presentation. Basically, in today's discussion, I would like to share at Ahmedabad University Center for Heritage Management what we are going through, particularly in terms of our heritage courses. And I would like to also reflect on how do we deal with this new situation that we are all facing today. So the topic of my sort of contribution here is pedagogy for ICH and COVID-19 like pandemic. So we have to keep in mind that this is not the only pandemic probably we are going to see. Around 100 years back, there was a similar pandemic, but probably 100 years is too long. We already forgot, and we probably didn't accommodate many of these situations in our pedagogy. So I'm going to focus on pedagogy aspect. Even though the focus is in ICS, it actually reflects on the larger domain of heritage management education. Many of you may HCAP, the APHENICH, UNESCO's initiatives. One of the conferences we had last year, where we discussed about pedagogy for heritage education, we're also looking at UNESCO's work on education for sustainable development, ESD, where education has been promoted as an important pillar of achieving the sustainable development goals by 2030. Now, within that, it is also now increasingly recognized that heritage education plays an important role, and more importantly, the intangible cultural heritage is a way to achieve a sustainable future, sustainable communities. Now, the ESD doesn't just focus on delivering education. It also has a few critical points that we need to keep in mind at the very beginning. It expects us to have our education be transformative to the students, but also to the society. It also expects us to, or guides us to reorient our existing pedagogy and think about the new context, emerging challenges, and address that, and translate that into the learning, the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to the students. Now, in that framework, how does ICS come into the education? It might come as a full-length program, it might come as a focused programs, or it might come into individual courses also, which I'm sure you all are aware of. But now let's think about what's happening to these different layers of education in today's times. The COVID-19, the coronavirus pandemic impacted the entire world. And I think all of us share the same kind of concerns that we are sharing today. One thing I must reflect is the disaster management has been a topic since last few decades, and we have probably progressed so much. But I think somewhere I find that the pandemics like COVID-19 was not in our radar very strongly. And that's why probably we missed out on some of the things. And I would share with you very quickly how in our program, we sort of missed out on that part. And as I mentioned, maybe it's that 1 century gap. Of course, there was other pandemics like the SARS, the MERS, and the Ebola and all that. But since these were not pandemic, these were endemic, I think we sort of didn't, took it as a global challenge. And here we are today facing this global challenge, and here we are to, discuss that. So I think this is an opportunity, and probably not an opportunity as an option, but opportunity as a compulsion to rethink our pedagogy for ICH as well as other heritage education. At the Center for Heritage Management, we run a master's program in heritage management. This is an overall framework of the program. I'm not going into detail here, but I would like to draw your attention to a few major components of the program where, due to this COVID-19 crisis, when India went into lockdown in 3rd week of March, we suffered seriously, and that still continues today. The inaugural seminar, which is supposed to happen next month for the new coming group, we don't know how we are going to do that. Field immersion, very critical component part of our pedagogy, where we engage with the communities to learn. We don't know, and we are rethinking now, how should we do the field immersion? Is it going to be a digital immersion? Is it going to be a sort of a virtual immersion within a classroom? We don't know, but we have to also look at our learning outcomes and see how better to deliver. Practicum, a very, very hands-on experiential learning with organizations and communities, a very important part of our curriculum. In the middle of the curriculum now has been tweaked, has been in process of tweaking and switching to this and that format. Similarly, social responsibility, a volunteer component that our program has. Now we can go to a community and do our social responsibility. So these are some of the components, and of course there are individual courses that couldn't be delivered because of this pandemic. Like we completed last semester by turning into online mode for most of the courses. But there were at least one course which we had to keep on hold because we couldn't think that course could be just offered online. So that means we have to think about our pedagogy, the philosophical framework of our pedagogy that was accepted in the program. Basically, our pedagogy had different components that you can see in these slides, different stakeholders, and the interaction between different stakeholders leading to different kinds of experience in our program. And these experiences were what you're seeing in different levels of the diagram earlier. Now, the emphasis was also, of course, the classroom learning in a typical university setting is the must today, but our heritage program particularly thrived more on the field-based learning. Because from the field-based learning, you achieve the transformative learning, you achieve learning that contributes back to the community, and you also achieve a meaningful, very critical understanding of heritage and probably thoughts for future management. Now, this entire pedagogical framework is in crisis today because we can't leave our home, we can't meet in the classroom, we can't go to the field. And therefore, at Ahmedabad University, we're thinking, how do we address this concern? Now, just to summarize what's happening in this situation, this is just an example of how this course that was postponed in last semester, and we don't know when we can resume this particular course. This is from one of those years when we were running this course. This particular picture is from a farmer's field, a farmer who is doing organic farming. We're learning with this farmer, being in his soil, under the tree, and learning about it. Now, there will be many other communities that will go and learn. For example, a craftsman community, a community of musicians, a community of social organizations who would be working with the gender issues, the social issues, but then connecting back to heritage and craftsmanship and all that. Now, this is halted. In this pedagogy that we had adopted, as you can imagine, communities is a major player in our learning process. And of course, the faculty, which are also now, stuck in their home, and the students. Now, the pedagogy was developed in this overlap between these three key stakeholders, and that would happen in this particular context, right? Now, this was the core of our pedagogy, which is now challenged to be delivered in this new situation. What has happened because of this situation is that very inquisitive and respectful students, their interaction with the welcoming communities, and a very collaborative and mentoring faculty, they have just now been separated apart. This is the new normal. This is the reality that we all are facing. Now, how do we deal with this? This is the crisis we're facing in our program, and I'm sure you are also all thinking about it. Of course, we can opt to just turn things into digital, but probably there are a few more issues. So just to share how we are responding to this crisis. In 1 month into the crisis, we decided, okay, let's catch up with each other. Let's catch up with faculty. Let's catch up with the students, graduates, alumni, and discuss how can we help each other? How can we continue our learning? So we organized an informal meeting, and this meeting was supposed to just focus on catching up with each other in a very informal manner. But the discussion went very seriously, and some of the points I have listed in the right low part of the slide, that the concern started saying, oh, what's happening with the craftspeople? What is happening with the communities that were supposed to visit last month? How are they managing their livelihood? How are they probably selling their products? How are they getting their raw materials? How are they practicing? How are they doing, the intergenerational transmission of the knowledge and all that? We started thinking about that. And those kind of questions led us to think, of course, we are running other courses online, but can these kind of courses be run online where we don't meet with the communities, we don't deal with them and just learn hypothetically? These are the serious questions to learn. But then these questions led to a very philosophical questions that what happens to our human relationship between these people who are our knowledge partners? Now we're not able to help them, not able to interact with them in person. So the students flag very important issues that do not we have a very serious social responsibilities beyond our typical academic teaching and learning? And that led us to think, at least, okay, let's start with this digital dialogues. And we started with a series of webinars, which are still happening. Last week, there was one. I think in the next week, on July 12th, we're planning another one on the indigenous knowledge systems. So a lot of webinars we organize in different themes, reaching out to different practitioners and communities. For this webinar, I would like to highlight one webinar that we did, which was really remarkable. One webinar we organized, which was coordinated by two of our alumni. And what they did was they reached out to the communities that we used to go and learn. And they identified at least one from each of these communities. So we had three panelists in this webinar. One was the village leader, the Sarpanch, the village headman. One was a folk artist. and one was an artisan who was practicing, different forms of art. Now we were through them, we wanted to find out how is their life in this difficult situation. And that conversation for 1.5 hours was so enriching, so powerful. If I have to summarize, I think two major things came out of that. One is their life is equally difficult as anybody else, because somehow in the policy system, somehow in the economic framework, their need, their aspirations were not counted. So they were living a different kind of a life. Now that made us think that, oh, maybe we need to go out and help them. But then at the same time, the second aspect came out very strongly, which is they were also very creative people. They're very creative communities. They found a way to help each other. They found a way to sort of make sure that they don't lose out their core practices. Of course, there were challenges also. People already started thinking about new occupations, because the hardcore craftsmanship was not going to survive, because some of them had a very peak season, and all of this sudden this lockdown happened. Some of them had the peak season coming up and they were preparing for it, but now it doesn't make sense to prepare because future was very uncertain, and therefore they were thinking to switch their occupation. They were thinking to do something else. Some of them, however, were also thinking very creatively, thinking, oh, if after the COVID crisis, if the new normal is going to be something else, how should we sort of modify our practices? How should we integrate technology into our practices? And thinking aloud. So for us, the lesson from this particular webinar was that we should not be thinking that, oh, these people need our help and we should just go and save them. I think there is so much that we can learn from them as they adapt to the new situations. I think for us, that's a very important learning. But we also need to keep in mind that the situation is not same across the board. And therefore, as some of them are very creative, some of them might be suffering very badly. They might be suffering for their livelihood. So how can you contribute? And I feel very happy to hear many of our students being so concerned about their livelihood, so concerned about helping the craft remaining alive for the new normal later on. So these are the kind of questions that came up, which then later on we realized that actually before the pandemic we had already started an extracurricular activity by the name of Heritage Learning Lab. Now the idea of this Heritage Learning Lab was, as much as we go out to the community and spend some time and do our courses by learning with them, we also wanted to contribute back to them. So this was since last 2 years, we had started some projects into the communities by helping them, learn some new techniques. For example, here, one of the picture you see a training program we are doing for the villagers to be able to at least use some simple techniques, understand some basics ideas about heritage documentation. And with these villagers, our students and graduates have been working at the field to document their heritage and see how heritage can be part of their development plan, right? Now, because of this experience, we felt maybe there has to be a new kind of a collaboration between the communities and educational institutions, but then this requires our pedagogic framework to be adapted, to be changed. And I think this is where right now we are thinking. And at this point, I would like to just share, as a way of concluding, some of my personal thoughts on what could be our new pedagogy to integrate ICH into our mainstream education, but also to make heritage education a meaningful process for our society, and thereby contributing to the SDG agenda as well. First and foremost is, of course, the digital, the online is not an alternative now. It's a reality now. And I think across the world, we have seen people have also adapted very fast. I mean, in our university, within a day or two, we adapted all our remaining courses completely online. So I think we have the technology. The webinar that I mentioned also tells us that people actually, at the villages also already adapted to some of the technologies, right? So there is no choice but to make sure that the limited, so far what was the limited use of digital and online technologies is a compulsion now. It's a new reality. We have to adapt it very creatively, very strongly. We have to expedite that process. There is no compromise in that. The second, a very important point is we have to empower not just our curriculum to be able to deal with the technology and make it available in any time, but we also need to empower our collaborators, the communities that we learn with, the ICS practitioners, the ICS bearers, the knowledge bearers. We need to make sure that they are also equally empowered. They can also work with the technology, not only to run their businesses, not only to transmit their knowledge, but also to think about the world in a different way, so that they're not left out in the new normal, right? And I think as an educational institution, this should also be part of our focus in the curriculum, so that the new curriculum is fair and accessible and equitable. Now that requires us to think about our courses very creatively now. We have to redesign our courses creatively. We have to have a flexible schedule, because now you can't go to a village for a week or 10 days. So, how do you keep learning? So we have to do that. But we have to keep in mind that we should not compromise on our meaningful engagement. And I still think this meaningful engagement can be achieved more by in-person engagement than just virtual engagement. Maybe virtual is there for some time, but we have to find new ways of having this in-person engagement also, and move forward. So this creativity and meaningful engagement is the third thought I have. Now, this also leads to some new challenges. Of course, in our program, we discuss about ethics. We have a course on ethics. But I think now is the time that we also need to rethink our ethical practices. We need to rethink about documentation. We need to rethink about use of technology. And therefore, the pedagogy also needs to ensure that a very critical discussion on ethical principles and processes, particularly relating to online and distant modes of engagement. What are the ethical? I think this is a new area we have to must research and bring into the curriculum. And then very carefully, we have to plan and deliver our new pedagogy. But the foremost important thing we have to keep in mind is, by doing this, by adapting to the new situation, we should be careful not to alienate the real life scenarios, real life practice of the ICS practitioners. Because in this increasingly virtual and online mode of practice and teaching and everything, we might make the ICS stories, the knowledge, the practitioners, it's just the digital characters somewhere and stories recorded somewhere and all that. I think we have to ensure that they remain a very living entity, very dynamic entity. And how do we ensure that? So I think we have to think about that in our new pedagogies and all that. So as a conclusion to my presentation, as a reflection of what are the struggles we are going through, I would like to mention that, in this kind of crisis, and maybe the crisis might come in another format in the futures to come as well, we may have to maintain physical distance, but we should never compromise on maintaining a very rich, engaging social and cultural relationships that are the core of ICS research, ICS safeguarding, but also ICS education. We need to make sure that our educational processes nurture this social relationship, even though we might be physically apart for the time being because of this crisis situation. But while doing that, my thought is probably three areas we need to think forward and integrate into our new pedagogy and practices. One, of course, is the technology. Second is ensure that the access and equity to the resources and outreach, the access to the resources and outreach is equally available to all stakeholders in the education practices that I earlier shared. And by doing that, we have also to make sure that the respect, the network of respect is not unbalanced. So the respect to the communities of practice needs to be maintained, because in this new crisis, when the economic situation is very volatile and all that, chances are very high that some of our ICS practitioners might suffer economically, and thereby they might also lose some of their social identity, social, the status and all that. You have to very carefully think that they should not lose out on their respect that the ICS was earning them otherwise. If they are compelled into a situation where they leave their ICS practices and go and do something else, we need to be careful about that. But also forcing into some ICS which may not be relevant to today might also. I think there's a larger set of dynamics that will be running around in the economics and social frameworks in the new normal situation. And I think our new pedagogy needs to also equally address that. So with those thoughts, I'll stop here, and I would look forward to a very meaningful conversation. Thank you very much.